Hi, Ram.
Hello,
How
Hector.
are you?
Good to see you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Okay, it's live on YouTube now.
But not on our screen here. We are seeing your screen right now.
Yeah. You won't see that.
Oh, okay.
Also starting the recording, but you can pause that recording once I make you host.
Yeah.
So let me pause the recording. I paused it, so we remember to restart.
Yep.
So why don't I just keep you as co-host, because that way you can do
Yeah,
everything.
that would be fine. And then make a Hector co-host too. Oh, and a commissioner. Is commissioner joined in yet?
No, only David, Dr.
No,
Father David, Hector, and you are here.
Okay. Once the commissioner comes in, then I will make him co-host. No, I can't make it, right? You have
I
to.
can make it. I can make it. That's not a problem. I'll just play the video.
Yeah.
I'll keep the video you queued up, and we'll play that. Yep. So I'll just
Come around 3 minutes to 2.
yeah. I'll just leave the screen with the presentation, so in case somebody joined, they know that they're the right place.
Yeah, right.
Is that okay?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so that way people, when they join, they know exactly that they're the right place.
Yeah, right.
All right, so I'll keep an eye, and I'll come in about 5 minutes before the start, and we'll start playing the video.
Sounds good. Thanks. Arvind.
So, Ram, you got my last email message about highlights in the bio?
Yeah, I got that. Now read that before I introduce you.
Oh, okay. So you're going to read the commissioner's bio?
No, I don't. You will be doing
No,
that.
I'm gonna do that, but what I sent you in my last email was a question about whether I should just cherry pick some highlights from the bio, or do you want me to read the whole bio?
No, you pick the highlights. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Oh, definitely pick the highlights. Yeah. You say last name Schnell?
Schnell.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
So at all times after I've introduced him, I just mute my own, right? Oh, there he is.
Yeah, there he is. Yeah. Oh,
Hello,
yeah.
Commissioner. How are you? It's Hector and Ram Gata.
He's connecting.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Perfect. Good deal. I had a few little issues trying to get on my on here today, but we got it worked out.
All right.
So did I. I'm not that great with computers,
Okay,
so Ram and Arvind helped me out.
Paul, here is the deal. This is Ram Gada on TCNV steering committee.
Yep.
With Hector. We will play the video of TCNV first. Then we will have some announcement about TCNV. Then I will introduce Hector Garcia, who will introduce you, and then it's all yours.
Perfect. And then I assume that I should just use the system here to show to share my screen on the PowerPoint.
No, we will make you co-host.
Okay, good.
In a couple minutes, so then you will be able to share the screen.
Okay, good. All right. So I'm learning something every day here. This is great.
Yeah, in a couple minutes, the other person who is the host I can't do it. He made me co-host, but he has to do it. So he will
Okay,
be
no problem.
here in a couple minutes.
And if you see a dog walk by, you're not having hallucinations. It's my dog. So just so you know, it's all good.
Okay.
Oh,
We will be recording this session. Is it okay, right, Paul?
yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's fine. This is really cool. This Hector, you're not going to read all that stuff, are you? You're just going to make it
No,
short.
I was gonna ask you, do you want me to highlight just some key points?
You can highlight whatever you want,
And
or you can highlight whatever you
Uh-huh.
want and go from there. But yeah, don't read all that stuff. It's just way too
oh,
much.
no, I wasn't intending on reading the whole thing, just a few highlights. And by the way, I was gonna mention our participation in the roundtable and the advisory committee at Humphrey. Do you know the Humphrey committee is still active? Oh,
Is
it
it
still
really?
is. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I
good.
think they are. I think they're still doing
It,
some work. I don't know all the details, but I believe they still are.
oh, good. I'll have to contact them. I haven't talked with them for a while.
Yeah.
So are you enjoying yourself? You're enjoying your new position?
I got to tell you that I didn't quite bank on it being what it is. You know, it has been so crazy. What an experience with COVID and so forth, and just so
Well,
much for
oh,
retirement.
you're the best man for these times.
I don't know.
And,
I don't know, Hector. I got to tell you, some days I think, oh, but I'm learning a lot. That's
yeah,
good.
it's difficult times, difficult times. That's why this is so important, you know, and all the work that is being done by other people. Um, Hopefully it'll succeed in every way.
Yeah, I think this is really the program is really cool. I just think it's really cool. I feel honored to be involved and a part of it. So thank you for that.
Well, it's all recorded, so whenever you have time to see some of the other presentations, I
Yeah.
think you'd enjoy
There's
them.
some really great sessions.
Yeah.
Really great sessions. Yeah. So I hope I can live up to it, but I think I'm excited about it. I look forward to it. So it'll be good. Have you had a sense of like what level of participation and involvement you've had in the electronic platform, or is it less of an issue because people can access content at different times?
I think Ram would be the one to answer that.
That plus we also live on Facebook, so people can also look at Facebook.
Okay.
But then this is all saved, so people can go anytime and look at it that way.
Wow, that's really cool. It's really nice to be able to do that. It's really amazing.
And then after this event is over 10 days, we will keep it on our TCNV website, all these symposiums. You know.
Yeah, that's great. It's really good.
We should be starting and pretty soon the video.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Yes, I'm going to start the video now.
All right, thank you, Arvind.
I see Father David is climbing down the mountains.
Stop that. Twin Cities Nonviolence vision is for the Twin Cities to be free from violence and have opportunities for each and every one. The way to stop violence is by love, forgiveness, and understanding.
Here in the Twin Cities, we do have challenges. We do want to be Minnesota nice. We strive to be that, but racism still exists here, and we just have a job to do.
Violence in the home is traumatic to a child. Trauma lasts forever if it's untreated.
In the Twin Cities, there are 3 police departments. There's the Highway Patrol, there's the Sheriff's Department, and then there's the City Police. But we're not afraid of the Highway Patrol or the Sheriff's Department, but we're afraid of the City Police. I wonder why that is. Could it possibly be training?
When we send 2 street outreach workers to an encampment of 30 people who are altered mentally and or chemically, that may not be enough of a response. And so currently in our society, the go-to is 911. For people who are living with a severe and persistent mental illness, the answer is a long-term social service and healthcare response, not a law enforcement one.
We can't have police officers with guns and tasers dealing with 12-year-olds behaving badly. What we need are trained professionals, people that know how to de-escalate, how to heal.
I admit I'm a racist. I don't want to be, and I'm trying not to be. I want to see the goodness in every person because I believe there are no bad people in the world. There are only good people who do bad things like being racist.
Unfortunately, racism exists very deeply in Minnesota history and in today's world. We lead the nation in some very ugly, disturbing categories for African Americans especially. And we are a city that has the resources to make a change in this. And I think we're seeing the city come together because of George Floyd, but we still have a long way to go.
When people think of homelessness, they often attach judgment. And the reality is, homelessness in Minnesota exists because of racism. It exists because of generational poverty and lack of education and a disconnect to power. People don't understand how dire the situation is. A father called seeking shelter. He had lost a job, it was a good job, and he was needing to separate his family in order to find safety. He said they were letting go of a lot of things, mainly each other.
My family was part of the largest gang in the state of Minnesota, and we preyed on kids. We have a gang problem in the Twin Cities just like a lot of other states. And the reason we have a gang problem is because kids are growing up without hope. And hope is just the breeding ground for attracting gangs. Gangs prey on kids that have no hope because they can't see a future, and they give them a future although it's dark.
The consequence, I wasn't thinking about none of that. The only thing I was thinking is gang banging. I didn't have a lot of opportunity, but gang banging, it is an opportunity, but it's way easier for you to join the gang than for you to go out and find a job. And that's you're gonna end up neither dead or you're gonna end up throwing your life away and you're gonna have to sit in jail for the rest of your life.
The biggest problem in America, in my opinion, is father absence. If every father went back and became a good father to their kids, we wouldn't have gang problems. We wouldn't have kids in poverty. We wouldn't have a lot of things that are going on wrong in this world if fathers would take their rightful place in a child's life.
When we have replaced the punishment model of eviction and expulsion and all the tough things we do with policing with a healing model and a mental health model, all our communities will be better and our children happier.
If I could wave my magic wand, the Twin Cities would do three things. All people would be in relationship with communities of color or those in poverty. We would end racism, and everyone would be able to afford a home.
Ram, go ahead. Ram?
Yep, I'm going there. Welcome to the virtual 10 days free from violence from September 18 through 27, Twin City Nonviolent. Our mission of Twin Cities is to reduce violence in all its forms, increase awareness and engagement in nonviolent policies and practices, bring together local community organizations, including nonprofits, religious institutions, educational institutions, and government and agencies, and dismantle the structure and system that lead to violence throughout the Twin City and beyond. We envision a Twin Cities community that is free from violence. Our intention is to reduce suffering in the world by challenging the unjust and oppressive social structures and by promoting peace with justice, equality, and dignity for all. What is 10 Days Free from Violence Conference all about? Why you organize this? By participating in this 10 days free from violence in the Twin Cities, in whatever way you or your organization take action against violence of any form, you can join with us to spread the word about action in which you are involved in the Twin Cities and surrounding areas. TCNV includes as partners, individuals or organizations that are taking nonviolent action to combat any forms of violence, police brutality, gun violence, domestic violence, housing and hunger violence, health violence, racial injustice, etc., using nonviolent methods, including speaking, training, education, the arts, and any other action dedicated to nonviolence. You can contact us, which is shown right now here, Twin City Nonviolent, for any information, any comments you have. At this time, I'd like to introduce Hector Garcia. Hector Garcia is a proud Mexican-American citizen, has contributed to building alliances between nations, cultures, and sectors through his positions in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He has taught and authored articles and essays on this subject, as well as a higher ed book, Clash or Complement of Cultures, Peace and Productivity in the New Global Reality. Hector Garcia will introduce our today's speaker, Honorable Commissioner Schnell. Hector, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Hector. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Ram, and thank you, Father Hurry, and 10 Days of Nonviolence in the Twin Cities for this opportunity to introduce Commissioner Paul Schnell, whose work and friendship I've been honored to enjoy for quite a few years. Before he was appointed by the governor as Commissioner of Corrections in 2019, he was the chief of police for 3 cities, including Maplewood, which was the time at which I had the opportunity to work with him in the Ramsey County Roundtable to build trust and cooperation between community and law enforcement, as well as the Police Community Advisory Committee at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. It is an honor for me to introduce my friend, Commissioner Paul Schnell.
Thank you so much, Hector, and thank you everyone for joining in. It's a real honor to be a part of this. I was just say that, I think this is really remarkable. The program over the 10 days, it's incredible. And just to be able to be invited to be involved is an incredible honor. So thank you for that introduction. And today what I wanted to do was to walk through, take a little bit of time to walk through, I think, a little bit about what I think is really the missing dimension in criminal justice. And I'm going to speak about this in the broadest sense, and I think it will relate much to what we even heard in the video at the start. But I think it's, and then we'll have some time to have a conversation. So I'm not sure, on the sharing screen, in terms of the PowerPoint, do I have to pull that up, or does that something that is out there that can be accessed?
No, you have a share screen on your.
Okay, so there it is. I see it. Oh, okay.
Just go there.
I have to just find it there. I'll open it up here. So can you see that now?
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. It shows that it's.
Where are your slides?
I saw them on there.
When you go to the share and you punch onto your slides, there are 2 buttons, and then you put the share there.
I haven't used this one before, so. Come on.
Okay.
Okay. Here we go.
There we go.
Okay, perfect. So that's coming through now, correct?
Well.
Yes, we can see the slide. It says.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, there we go.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. This is new. I'm not used to Zoom so much. We use a little different system here. So, I really want to talk about this. So as we think about this whole notion of what is community and what's criminal justice, I want to spend a little time talking about that, because I think when we start talking about things like what is community or what is criminal justice and how does that differ from things like justice becomes really important. We want to also, I think, address the issues around the really important and critical role that community must play if we want to achieve very different outcomes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the outcomes we've seen in criminal justice and how this really relates to the system that operates, ultimately, oftentimes grounded in things like in systemic racism and really profound disparities that exist in the system. And some of those disparities that we are very much responsible for as one of the players in the system. We want to talk about, how is it that we begin to prompt some of the shifts prompt some of the shifts that are necessary in order to address this paradigm that right now really is heavily focused on okay, I think, okay, now this should be good. That we move away from a punishment to one that is really, in the way we see justice, and move to something that is really a difference by way of restoration. And then how is it that we access deepened opportunities for engagement that ultimately supports the restoration and reintegration of people who are system involved and begins to dismantle some of the systemic racism and disparities in our system. So that's what I hope we can accomplish in our time here together and as we go through. I want to talk a little bit about the. I'm pulling a different slide here, so I'll go back. When we look at the racial makeup, and the slide that got sent that I have here is different than the one that the final. This may be a little bit of a challenge here because I picked a slide that was in development, but the racial makeup of Minnesota's prison system is really roughly looks at about 53% of our population. 54% is white. Then we look at African Americans constitute about, or 52, 38% of the population is made up of African Americans. Native Americans make up about 8% and 2% are Asian. And so when we look at these, at the barriers in our system, ultimately we have to look at the fact that despite the fact that the majority of people in our prisons are white, it does not reflect the makeup of Minnesota. When we talk about probation in Minnesota at any given day, there's about 103,000 people on probation. Our prisons are roughly at about 7,500. Right now, 7,550, in fact, as we look today. And on supervised release or parole in our state on any given day, it's about 7,500 people. And so Minnesota, by way of background, has one of the lowest incarceration rates anywhere in our nation, but has one of the highest rates among the highest rates of supervision across people under court or probation or correctional system supervision. So we can see big differences in terms of those numbers. When I talk about community here, oftentimes people will look at community and they will think about a group of people with diverse characteristics that are linked by ties and common perspectives and engage in joint action in geographical locations or settings. For me, when I talk about this whole notion, I believe that community is really not a place, but better understood as a system of social cohesion, referring to the extent of connectedness or solidarity among individuals and groups. And so when I think about the notion of how criminal justice operates, ultimately, it should be driven far more toward this notion of social cohesion, the growing of community and the growing of connection among and between individuals and groups within the social context. And if we were more focused on that, ultimately, it would reduce many of the problems. All of the research that we know speaks to that. When we talk about criminal justice, and the slide that I'm using here this is not the slide I really was hoping for. Hang on one quick second. I'm just gonna take a peek here and see if I can access. When we talk about the system, and what when I talk about criminal justice and what that is, ultimately, it is, I don't know if that's coming across. Are you seeing the same thing you were before? Okay, we got some little technical glitch here.
No, Paul, this is a new one now we are sent.
Okay, you're seeing the one that, all right. So when we think about, I talked about community already, we're gonna move here to criminal justice. So this is not, that's not the slide that we should be showing here. Let me stop share there for a second. I gotta get to the right place here because that's, ultimately, sorry about this. I thought it would be easier to. Yeah, it's not the one. All right, I'm just trying to get to the right place here. Sorry about this. Is that showing now? It's hard for me to see exactly what's happening.
No, we are seeing your screen.
Okay, I just.
Okay, now I think now we see it.
All right, perfect. So this should fix it. I'll catch up to where we are here.
Yeah.
Perfect. So when we talk about criminal justice, we're really talking about this whole notion of the system of law enforcement that involves all of the different players, prosecution, lawyers, the courts, corrections, and it's the entire process of criminal proceedings and punishment. And I want to be really clear that oftentimes we conflate the notion of criminal justice and is synonymous with the notion of justice. And I'll talk more about this, but I think if we're going to be honest, the criminal justice system as a system does not always conflate issues around justice, because ultimately we are addressing what was oftentimes a breach in time and did not reflect a broader sense of what was happening at the time. And so we'll talk more about that. But I want to be clear that sometimes people will say criminal justice has little to do with justice, and I would agree that sometimes there can be a pretty significant disconnect between the two. So I want to talk a little bit about this and really kind of walk us back a little bit more as we think about the whole notion of how people get engaged in acts of wrongdoing, and what does that mean from a criminal justice standpoint. So I would start by asking this question. There's a criminologist named John Braithwaite. John Braithwaite is an Australian. criminologist, and he writes a lot about the whole notion of shame. And Braithwaite, different than many of the many criminologists, instead of asking why is it that people engage in wrongdoing, Braithwaite instead flipped that question and said, why is it that most people do the right thing most of the time? And when we ask that, when you ask that question, oftentimes what you begin to hear from people is, you may hear things like, well, it's all about it feels good. It's about my conscience. It's what I want to be liked. It's my friends and my family and my peers' sphere of consequences. And when you ask these questions of people, oftentimes they will think about the ways in which they are influenced, their behaviors have been influenced. And it's interesting always when I ask people this question is, why do you do the right thing most of the time? Oftentimes people at different stages of their life will say, well, because I didn't want to be punished. And yet we know that while punishment may have some effect, we know that it does not. Deterrence has not been the biggest factor. Ultimately, even in the video early on, you talked about the young man talked about his involvement in gangs being an easier way for him to connect than it was through jobs and other types of pro-social things. And so ultimately, he was speaking to the notion of he found connection there. And so it's who do we connect with? And really this whole notion of why do most people do the right thing most of the time becomes a really important question for us, because it should govern everything as it relates to how we create more strongly connected communities, and ultimately what's going to be effective in criminal justice. And so Braithwaite really helped us, to lay a groundwork for thinking about this. And so Braithwaite argued that societies are groups that have a strong cultural dimension of shame. Now, let me be really clear about his shame, and he talked about this relative to the lower crime rates. Braithwaite wasn't talking about shame in the context of the way we oftentimes think about shame today, where it's like, you are what you did. Braithwaite was talking about this sense of shame that you might feel when, I'll use my own example, when my mom would found out that I was involved in some things that really were not up to the standard that she expected, and that I certainly expected, something that I didn't want her to know about, something that I was involved with that didn't reflect well on me or her. And there was oftentimes that sense from her that, when that happened, that, I felt this real sense of shame. It wasn't because she said you're a bad person or a bad kid. She loved me. She cared about me. But ultimately, it was the depth of my relationship with her that caused me to want to do well in her eyes. And ultimately, this is the kind of shame, this communitarian sense of shame that Braithwaite's talking about. Not the you are what you did type of shame that you're no good, you're a bad person or a good person. This is really about that sense of that my breaches, the things that I'm involved in, that ultimately create separation of me from the people that really matter in my life. So I think that's an important part of this as we think about the nature of what the system does, that ultimately, if we want safer communities, we want less harm to come to communities and victimization, and even people engaged in acts of wrongdoing, ultimately, much more strong connection and this dimension of shame that comes naturally from relationships becomes so important. He also talked about, he talked about this in the context of what he referred to as the notion of reintegrative shaming. And Braithwaite talked about that shame is really innate in human beings and is experienced in a couple of different ways. One is that internal sense of socialization, the way we were brought up, in the cognition, our ability to think through the difference between right and wrong, and the sense of conscience that gets developed over time may come from and be rooted in a level of some faith orientation or just our socialization. And then secondarily, this kind of external sense, and these are oftentimes very much reinforcing the external things that come from sanction or condemnation. And importantly here, it's about the communities of care. It's about from my family, it's about other people with whom I have significant and profound relationships. Because ultimately, it's when there is not that sense of connection, when there is not that sense of depth, that I may not feel that sense of shame. It's one of the things that when we look at the criminal justice process, the system that it operates today in courts, oftentimes for the people that are going through the court system, they feel as though the person who is transacting this and who's operating the process, the judge, is kind of up there and very much separate from me, and the people with who can best impose a sense of social condemnation or control, or even grow my ability to want to be more pro-social, are in fact the people that I deeply respect and admire. And so as we think about this, Braithwaite's hypothesis was simply that we're individuals, individual wrongdoers, and all of us, that meets all of us, ultimately are confronted, which is just another way of saying shamed, and within a continuum of respect and support. And Braithwaite would say that is fundamental. And that's what's oftentimes missing in our current systems. There is not that continuum of respect and support. And what he would say is then and only then can this process of reintegration, of creating community, even out of bad experiences for the people who've been harmed or the people who have caused the harm, ultimately, this is where that can change. And so we really have to acknowledge the internal realities of the good, the intrinsic worth of people, and yet reject the conduct that they engaged in. And that's what really happens today in healthy families. Parents are oftentimes saying, I love you and I care about you, and therefore you're not the things you're doing are not living up to that. And that's the kind of place that Braithwaite would say we need to do a better job, and our system needs to reflect that. And so what he would say that if we apply this, it allows for the individual act of wrongdoing or unacceptable behavior to be rejected because the person, I failed to reach the expectations or standards that were set as a natural part of our relationship, while still acknowledging my value, my worth, and still the opportunity to be loved and cared for as a contributing member of society, of our family, of our relationship. And what you begin to see is that there is a level of being able to prompt and encourage a sense of change through this application of firmness and fairness, or other words might be pressure and support. And I'm going to connect back to this in a little while. So in Braithwaite also kind of talked about this whole notion of the difference between what he said was reintegrative shaming and stigmatizing shame, or the shame that we oftentimes are really comparing to. And what that looks like is that in the notion of reintegrative shame, it generally tends to be can be more informal. It's much more personal. It's challenging and engaging in the context of relationship. And that itself defines this sense of, I am still okay, but and I can be a good person, but but my behavior did not rise to that level. And ultimately, there is the opportunity for restoration and reacceptance. versus the system that we may oftentimes see in our criminal justice process today, which is this formal or highly impersonal or confrontational system that ultimately stigmatizes. And we know that our system has so many collateral consequences that ultimately this notion of stigmatizing shame becomes very destructive. And we see this play out in our communities where people can never be redeemed. And as a result, they end up being they're outcasted, and they no longer feel like they have a place or a value. And ultimately, when that happens, it's certainly not good for them, and it's really not good for anyone. So the importance of us having connections and making sure that community has a place in this context of addressing issues of wrongdoing and how we respond to ideally to violence. Ideally, that would be through the practice of nonviolence, but it has to start, I believe, at some level with building a sense of community. Is one, and deeper connection is going to help us prevent violence in our communities. And at the same time, it's the same equation for how we deal with and address wrongdoing that occurs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this notion of shame by talking about this compass of shame. Don Nathanson was a Philadelphia psychiatrist. I think he died about 2 years ago, a year or two ago. I think it's 2 years ago now, if I'm not mistaken, like December of 18 or November of 18. Nathanson died. He was really a brilliant psychiatrist and scientist, medical doctor, and did a lot of work in this whole area of the study of affect or human emotion. And one of the areas that was of great interest of Don Nathanson was the whole notion of shame. And ultimately, in Nathanson's work around shame, he talked about the fact that people oftentimes respond to experiences of shame in a variety of oftentimes patterned ways. And he said that there's 4 polar ways in which we oftentimes respond to shame. And I'll lay a caveat to this as I talk about each of these things. So if we think about the center of this compass, the center of the compass being the kind of and you might even think about this in our own daily lives. I oftentimes think about this when in those times when I feel like I'm vulnerable, or particularly maybe I felt like I didn't do my best, or I was exposed for not knowing something or not being aware of something. And so then when I'm in that position, that's the center of the compass. I feel exposed, I feel weak, I feel vulnerable. If I don't have strong connections or relationships or people that can help me navigate that, then what Nathanson would say is that I have a tendency to respond in one of those 4 polar ways. That being withdrawal, attack self, avoidance, or attack others. And I'm going to give some examples of the way in which you might see this. And these are oftentimes seen as scripts that many of us will follow. And I can tell you that when I think about my own sense of this, and where when I feel that sense of weakness or vulnerability, I know that my tendency is to move toward first withdrawal. And what that withdrawal means is that when let's say I've said something to my wife that was a flip comment but I knew the minute I said it, it was like, that was not a smart thing to say, that hurt. And I could see it. I feel this sense of shame because I recognize that there was a breach, that something I did caused a reaction and created the separation. Now, in a healthy moment, what I should be doing is saying, oh I can't believe I said that. That was really thoughtless. I apologize. It's really more of a reflection on me than it is you. And we get back into the business. But instead, I might use the strategy of withdrawal, and I stay away I just avoid. I'm being near her, because anytime I'm near her and see her in that moment of withdrawal and that experience of shame, it forces me to cast attention on the attribute of myself that I don't want to look at. And so withdrawal is a very common strategy for people to avoid going around the people or places that ultimately require us or force us to look at ourselves. You know, and oftentimes we can see a connection. Another strategy might be the strategy of attack self. And you know, that one is one that, you know, I think if we think about the continuum of attack self, obviously attack self on the weakest form can be things like, you know, putting myself down, diminishing my own worth or my own value. It might be grounded in low self-esteem. Well, I don't like that notion, but it you know, on one side of the continuum, the most significant form of attack self we can see is that of suicide, of a person taking their own life. And oftentimes it's associated with this deep sense of an attribute about self that may not even be realistic, but it's something that, because of the challenges or the chemical processes in the brain or other sorts of things, that ultimately it becomes very difficult for them to overcome that in the absence of really strong connections and deep relationships. So attack self is another strategy. I will oftentimes use the story of people would say, well, what does attack self look like in my own life? I would say something like, I would do something, Flip, where I would allow my kids to do something. And my wife would say, you know, they would go to my kids would run to their mom and say, Dad said we could do this. And my wife would come to me and say, really, you let them do that? And because I knew it wasn't my brightest moment of parenting, my response to her, in fact, was, well, I guess I'm just a terrible parent. And so what I've done is I diminished my responsibility. I diminished my, you know, my quick response to that situation. But instead of just owning, yeah, it wasn't my brightest moment of parenting, I actually use a strategy that allows me not to really take a look at what happened there. So oftentimes you can see a connection, Nathanson says, between withdrawal and attack self. And what he would say is that all of us probably use these strategies at some level on a regular basis, and we have a script of things that might be more common for us. And so this is not just about people in the system, although this is very much at play with people in the system. And really, I think, is reflective of what can happen, what our system can actually cause people to do. But I do think it does become something that is applicable to all of us. Nathanson talked about this whole notion of the strategy of avoidance. And some people will say, well, it seems like withdrawal, you know, you staying away from your wife is the same as avoidance. And while it can be elements of that, the way Nathanson described avoidance, it was the use of something else to keep my attention away from where the spotlight of shame casts its attention, or that weakness or vulnerability. And the best ways we can see this can be things like denial, the use of drugs or alcohol or work or sex or food, all these different strategies that we can use, the accumulation of wealth and focus on having things instead of depth in our relationships. These may all be strategies that we use to actually keep us apart from other people. And then finally, he said, was the strategy of attack others. And that can be also a broad continuum. It can be everything from just verbally lashing out or use of put downs and to keep people separate. But attack others can really go to the extreme all the way up to and including the taking of another person's life. And oftentimes what Nathanson would say is, if we better understand what's happening to people in the experience of shame, then if the best way to address that is by strengthening the relationships that all of us have, which ultimately helps us navigate the waters that come with the challenges that all of us face. And so the compass becomes an important way for us to understand. And this just gives you lays out a sense here of just some really simple descriptions of what those different elements of the pole, the different polar responses can include.
Exactly.
So I hear somebody's voice, so if there's a question or something. So Nathanson said that he described shame as a central social regulator that governs our personal interactions with one another, because he really felt that ultimately that the experience of shame, when there is not strong relationships, can actually cause separation. And yet it is that shame is a fundamental, or weakness or vulnerability is a fundamental human attribute, that when we have strong and good supportive relationships, can minimize the impact of shame and help us to be our most full selves, and even to address issues that come up in our lives. So when we think about this whole notion of shame and the work of Braithwaite in terms of asking that sense of, why is it that most of us do the right thing most of the time? Braithwaite would say it was all boiled down to the desire to keep and maintain a level of connection. John Nathanson would say that the same thing, that ultimately the depth of relationship helps us, and connection help us to navigate the experiences of human weakness, vulnerability, or shame. And so when we think about this whole notion of rules and compliance with rules, we have to understand that compliance is really not an end to itself, but it's an outcome that comes from an understanding, and that understanding is in the broadest communitarian sense. And ultimately, that inappropriate behavior or breaches or violations of community standards might be more of an opportunity for insight and learning. And that ultimately the rules that we have, instead of being viewed as ways of control, ultimately can begin to be seen in the context of promises and commitments to help our brothers and sisters achieve and realize and be their best selves. And ultimately, if there were stronger and deeper connections, it would both reduce the likelihood of people's engagement in acts of crime or wrongdoing, and at the same time, it becomes the very ways, as I mentioned earlier, that we ultimately address afterward issues of wrongdoing. So this really moves us into where we're going, and we're gonna open this up here in a little bit, but a few more things I want to go through before we do that. Is that ultimately when we think about, I think about the system and the work of the Department of Corrections, that ultimately we have been part of a system that has been with a heavy emphasis on punishment. And that ultimately the work that we've been doing and the way the system is itself set up, it increases disconnection. And so ultimately, as I think about where we're going and what's necessary, is that we really need to encourage the use of these relational practices or approaches, and that really this is what being restorative is about. To manage wrongdoing and diminish or reduce conflict and tension, and focus on the reparation of harm, increased connections, and strengthening relationships. The development, it's the very development of community. And that's ultimately when we think about the notion of criminal justice and the ways in which community has to play a role. It has to be that we, I think as in the video, it was a great thing when they were talking about the three things that they wished that, was that one, that there was reduced level, that we wiped out racism, that there was deeper connections with people who are poor or come from different areas, and that people had access to have their basic needs, housing and other things met. That ultimately a big portion of that was grounded in connections and relationships and seeing and regarding people as for their fullest humanity, no matter the circumstances. So this is going to be very similar to what we begin to see then in our systems. That when we look at our system today, it's oftentimes focused on this adversarial. The focus is on the past, what people have done, was heavily preoccupied with blame, and deterrence is linked to punishment. And versus in this restorative or relational, the focus is on the past, present, and future. We have to recognize that there has been harm, and what does that mean today? And then how is it that we move forward from there with an emphasis on focus on the resulting harm and the reparation of that. And that deterrence is fundamentally linked to the strength of relationships and a level of personal accountability that comes through those relationships. And I think what becomes so important and relevant to this, in order for any type of punishment or sanctions, accountability to be effective in helping to change behaviors, they need to be delivered in a context that provides both meaning and relevance to the people who are experiencing it. It's very interesting for me because I have a unique role now that I didn't even know was part of the job until I got here. But in Minnesota, the commissioner is the parole authority for people who are serving life sentences. And a life sentence in Minnesota means unless it's life without the possibility of parole, and there's about 110 people in our system who face life without the possibility of parole. There is the remainders of those have to serve a minimum of 30 years. And so when I think about this whole notion of what punishment and sanctions to be effective, oftentimes in the meetings that I have with people who are coming up for parole, the conversations aren't just about the fact that, look, you serve 30 years. It's about the context with which they understand that. And that is at some level, this obligation to live their life in a way that gives meaning and relevance to the life that they may have been involved in taking. And it's been really amazingly powerful to be involved and to hear the stories from these people who've been involved in these really, I think, horrific kinds of crimes, and yet the opportunity that they see in terms of understanding their act of wrongdoing in the context of their personal obligation to live a better life, oftentimes grounded in the relationships that they have with people, that their family members or other supporters who mean so much and who they want deeply and badly to make proud going forward. And so I think this really becomes important, and too often today it's punishment, and there is no context for that. The people that are most able to help provide both support and accountability in meaningful ways are not involved in the criminal justice process, and therefore disconnected. And it really, I think, aids and adds to this whole notion of the circle and cycle of reoffending. So I want to just ask you to think about for a minute the people that somebody that you greatly respect, and what is it about this person? I oftentimes ask people to think about this and identify them in their mind's eye. Who is this person? What made them so special? And ask yourself, what was it about them that allowed you to feel that deep sense of respect and admiration? And I would ask this question: when that person challenged you, or when that person confronted you with something that you did or said, or even it doesn't have to be anything big. It's just the everyday kinds of ways that we can fail as human beings. How did you feel as a result of that experience? What was it about the way they challenged you? And for many people, it was that they were treated in a way that was firm. Like they would say, look, I think about some of the teachers I've had that I really admired. And when they would say to me, hey, Paul, you need to knock that off, because of the way in which the relationship I had with it, I wanted to be responsive to them. And yet I knew that they would let me show who I was and give me enough latitude to demonstrate that they could be fair in the way they responded to me, but it was the relationship that allowed that to happen. And so I think when we think about this whole notion of how do we balance firmness and fairness, we can begin to ask these questions. And even coming back to us, what's the experience of a boss or a person who is all about being firm but not fair? And we have words that we would use to describe these people, and not words that I want to have on recording, right? And we might also ask ourselves, what was the experience of the boss or that teacher or that person who was all about fairness? Whatever you need to do, but there was no sense of boundaries. Well, I think many of us would say that person is a pushover. They're easy, they're weak, they're undemanding. And so there is a balance here. And how do we find that? And I think there's a couple of women wrote an article called Fair Process. And in this notion, there is this sense of providing us a kind of a vision, a view of how in which how social discipline might be at play here. And what they talk about is that if we take on the up and down axis from low to high, we can look at firmness, and another word we might use there is pressure. And high pressure, high firmness, low fairness, high pressure, low support is a punitive response. That those people tend to be very authoritarian or stigmatizing. There is a separation that happens. Whereas when we take a look at the whole notion of the absence of firmness and fairness, there is literally no connection. I oftentimes thought about this in my dealings with young people who were experiencing neglect. There was no one that expected much of them, and there was no one really to support them. And so that is by definition this sense of neglect. It was indifference or passivity. Then there is those people who are all about fairness, and there's very little expectation, and you might describe them as being more permissive on this scale, and they are easy or protective, undemanding on that scale. And then we can talk about those who tend to be more relational. And these people are authoritative and they are respectful. So they, my teacher who could confront me about that, they certainly exercised their authority, but it was done in such a way that it allowed me to maintain my dignity because of the depth of my relationship with them. And so how do we begin to think about and describe these quadrants? And I think about this oftentimes as a boss. I think about this in terms of how do we create a system that ultimately gives more focus to this notion of being both high levels of firmness and fairness and balancing that. You might say that the person who is all about firmness and not at all about fairness, they do it to you. The person who's all about fairness and not at all about firmness, they do it for you. The absence of firmness and fairness is not at all. And ultimately, how is it that we create a system where we combine and balance this sense of both high levels of firmness and fairness, or pressure and support, other ways of describing that, as being with. And these are the places, this is the opportunity and the place that, as I think about as a parent, I would like to operate as a parent in this quadrant. More often than not, I think about this as a boss or a supervisor. How do I have a depth of relationship that allows me to maintain my level of authority, and that's not authoritarian, but my authority as a leader. And at the same time, this notion I have to be respectful and honor the knowledge and skills, abilities, and talents of the people who ultimately exist within the organization that I'm a part of. So ultimately, whether it's a parenting or boss, or even in our criminal justice system, how do we begin to create systems that ultimately provide a much higher level of focus on this notion of what is of being relational? And so these become the operating domains. And so this firmness becomes defined as pressure, limits, expectations. Fairness is support, encouragement, or nurturing. And the core question becomes, let me go back there, is which domain do we practice within? And I think we can look at this both as on an individual practitioner level, and a community member, a parent, a boss, a teacher, whatever place we happen to come from. How is it that I, as an individual, help do that? And then ultimately, how, in my role, I oftentimes think about how is it that we create a system that reflects this level of both pressure and support, limits and expectations, and with encouragement and nurturing and support. So when you ask people, I always expect to be treated blank by those I respect, and most commonly it's fairly. So I just want to talk a minute about this, and then we'll bring this to somewhat of a close here. But this whole notion of what's fair process, and the way which our system operates today is more heavily grounded in due process. It is a system of rights that we all have extended to us, as opposed to this level of fair process. And really, I think this model, and this comes out of a Harvard Business Review article by the two French women I was talking about, is this whole notion of the elements of fair process. And I'm just going to quickly go through this, and so we can have some conversation. And I love this, because the central idea around this is that individuals are more likely to place trust and cooperate freely with systems, whether they themselves win or lose by those systems when fair process is observed. Now that's a mouthful. It's a real mouthful, but all of us have experienced this before, where we didn't get what we wanted. We said, look, this is what I think should happen. This is the way it should go. We didn't get that, but at the end of the day, we walked away from it saying, at least the process was fair. And I think this is something that, as a system and as community, how do we begin to create this and make this more commonly? And what these two women, Kim and Magborn, talked about in their article was that there are really three elements. And this is none of this is rocket science. I think that this is the crazy part. And yet it's interesting how hard it is for us oftentimes to do these things. The three elements of fair process are, first, engagement. And this involves as students or their families or people in the system or wherever it happens to be, workplaces. You can go across the spectrum to weigh in, to engage, to talk about decisions that affect them and ask for their input and allow them to tell their stories and speak to their experiences. Principle 2 is explanation. That everyone involved and affected by a decision should understand why final decisions have been made and what was considered in the context of that, so that there was a consideration of feedback and the opportunity for learning. And finally, that there has to be a level of expectation clarity, that once decisions are made and new rules are clearly stated, so that those rules and standards and expectations, along with the penalties and sanctions for failing to rise up to them, are understood. Now, again, what they would say is this has to happen in the context of relationship. And so community has to give voice to this. And ultimately, when that happens and when there is a depth of relationship, this model becomes very much easier for people to see in play. And so when we think about what they talked about, what fair process is not, and it's not about decision making by consensus. Well, that's a great thing to do. The reality is we live in such in times and in really in places where we face incredible challenges. And so we may not get to full consensus, but we have to achieve and allow for the voices of everyone to be lifted to equally high levels, and ultimately make sure that there is an opportunity for full, deep engagement, and that those voices are considered as we talk about the standards through which we're going to enforce in our communities and/or the consequences that come. And when I talk about consequences, I'm not even talking about punishment in the strictest sense. I'm talking about the breach, the separation of community, and how it is that we ultimately re-engage with people. Fair process does not just set out to win the support of others through compromise that we can accommodate every individual's opinions, needs, and interests. Ultimately, we want to try and address and get as much and meet as much as we can. But ultimately, there are going to be limitations, and we have to recognize that. Now, this, you might say, well, that doesn't seem like overly fair. The reality is, in the due process system that we have today, none of this is even considered, because engagement is not the name of the game. Think about the court process itself. It is a group of people, oftentimes not me or the people who have been harmed by my wrongdoing, who are involved in that conversation. It's my attorney, it's the prosecutor, it's a judge, it's all the system players, but I'm not a part of that. My voice doesn't matter. The voice of victims are not brought into this. It really becomes a challenge for people to see and understand what that looks like. It's not just about democracy in action or in any group process. It's not about bosses or leaders or others forfeiting their prerogative to make decisions and policies. That said, they have to be grounded in deep levels of engagement. And the more community is involved in that, the fairer and broader and more communitarian those decisions are going to be. When fair process is experienced, and certainly I think we've all experienced this along the way, that even if we didn't get what we wanted, that fair process has a tendency to help build a level of trust and commitment in us. That trust and commitment produces a level of voluntary cooperation. And so in stronger, more cohesive communities, we ultimately see voluntary cooperation with the community standards, because in each individual's value and worth as a member and their voice is engaged and brought into the whole notion of what defines community for us. And this voluntary cooperation drives performance, which ultimately leads people to go beyond the minimum. And ultimately, as we think about the potential, the human potential that exists, I think about the human potential that exists in our prisons and our criminal justice system today that is wasted, and that there is not today really clear opportunities for them to re-engage and be redeemed and come back into full, deep connection with the community, and that we have to change. We need to allow people to be their fullest self, and they do this by sharing their knowledge, their experiences, which ultimately leads to creativity and stronger moral development, and deepened relationships. This is by essence the creation of community. And how does that happen? It ultimately happens when we practice and use fair process is what defines with. That whole notion of high pressure or firmness, high pressure and high support, or firmness and fairness is defined or recognized or is defined by the whole notion of fair process. When we can provide fair process, that's how we achieve with. So you'll see some of this stuff the slides are available, and I think will be posted. But I'm gonna just, if we think about ways, and there's been some work done in terms of thinking about the ways in which questions that we ask of people who, when we challenge someone's behavior with whom we have a relationship, and we ask certain questions, this oftentimes tends to help people walk through this. But important questions about, what were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected by what you've done? And how is it that you go about making things right? Is ways that really values people's worth. And when we talk about the people who've been harmed, and I want to talk about this, and I've mentioned this in here, but we oftentimes have this false sense of dichotomy, that the whole notion of victim and perpetrator. And I think what ends up happening is that the division and that exists oftentimes between that sense can be a misnomer, because certainly at any given time, any of us, we both are people who engage in wrongdoing, and most of us, it's not criminal wrongdoing, but it tends to be things that can hurt or harm people around us. And similarly, we both engage in it, and we both experience that harm. And so this whole notion of separating, you're either a victim or you're a perpetrator, is a false dichotomy that we create. And if we want people who are involved in the system, people who have engaged in wrongdoing, to do better, we deepen our relationships and connections with them. If we want victims to do better, which we all do, we deepen our connections and give their voice a raise too. We do both. It's not an either or. And I think that has been the misnomer, and ultimately leaves people feeling like you're either for victims or you're for perpetrators. And the truth of the matter is, if we take a communitarian response, we're to bring up the voice and the depth and recognize both perspectives and the need for higher levels of support along that way. It's interesting when you look at these questions. When I was a police chief, before I was a police chief, and I was a police officer pushing the squad, and I was doing training with officers, I would ask them I required them to, when they would take a report from somebody who experienced wrongdoing or victimization, I would ask them to ask one of the questions on this list. And I would just ask you I wonder how many of you would be able to pick the question I would ask them, the officers, to ask, as they would, they got all the details, the names, and what was lost, and how it happened, or what the story was. And there was one question I said that I don't care if it's a theft from auto case or if it's a domestic assault or whatever it may be. I would like you to ask this one question. And out of that list, I would ask you to think about what it would be. And I will tell you that the question it was what's the hardest thing for you? And it was so interesting for me when people would talk about things like, so their shed got broken into on their backyard, and you would ask them the question, and I might expect people to say, well, of course they took my lawnmower or whatever, and it's a pain, I have to make an insurance claim or whatever it would be. But oftentimes it was things much deeper than that. And people would, the officer would say, what's the hardest thing for you? And they would say, I thought this was a much more connected community. And when you talk about the role we can play in that, because the reality is that we're not likely to solve that lawnmower theft. That's not the real terms. But ultimately, if one of the roles of the system is to create deeper and stronger connections, to understand the emotional dynamics that are involved in this, then really understanding what's the hardest thing for them becomes so important. And this question is not really dissimilar to the question that we might even ask of people when you ask the question of who's been affected. It's so often The people that, when I do parole hearings today, people will talk about, certainly it was my victim and my victim's family, but I think about the harm I caused to my own family, to my siblings, to my, and that recognition and being able to give voice to that. And then for a family to be able to support that, and for us to be able to support that, the build community becomes really powerful. So as we think about, if we want to help people change their behaviors, we have to help them feel connected. We have to help them feel included. We have to emphasize why their behavior is unacceptable and discussing the important emotional impacts of this. And that's best. And I have teachers in school community here, but because this is the same, whether we're talking about what happens in our schools, whether we're talking about neighborhoods, whether we're talking about cities, or even in our prisons. That we do this by modeling appropriate behaviors, by doing everything that we can to help build community, to treat others with respect, to providing support, acknowledging trauma and marginalization, and freely apologizing when that's necessary. And these are things that oftentimes we don't model, and especially when it's the wrongdoing of somebody else. It's easy for us to dismiss or not take responsibility for our own roles. And so one of the things that I think about in terms of being in a leadership role over the Department of Corrections is I have to acknowledge the fact that our system itself has furthered, advanced issues around some of our racial disparities. And so I have to own and take responsibility for that and do everything I can to make sure that we're engaging in systems and processes that reduce that likelihood. And to be completely honest, the best way to do that is deepened levels of involvement and engagement of community members in our system. We focus on building a system that cares about those who experienced both wrongdoing and engaged in that. We must, as a system, begin to understand the whole person and recognize that every person has an intrinsic human value. We must engage the system, system-involved people, in acknowledging their strengths, their risks, and their needs. And we must engage them through a combination of firmness, expectation, pressure, and support to engage in transformational services that will aid them, that will help us grow community, and that will reduce the risk of harm in our communities. That when we think about the system and community alignment, that our transformational effectiveness will increase when system-involved people experience the support and pressure in relationships to others and their support network and their communities. And so it's no longer okay for us as a broad community to say, as long as they're in prison, we don't have to care about them anymore. That's not acceptable. It's not going to be okay, and it's contrary to our own interests. And as we work to develop an approach that really is person-centered, that ultimately works with system-involved people in a way that includes early and regular involvement of community in helping them, that is what is going to create and make a difference. And I would just say of community engagement, we know that it is easier said than done. Oftentimes we can have people. I spent some time over the weekend with a group of people talking about the roles of faith communities, and frequently we hear from people of great faith, and there is that disconnection between some of the tenets of our faith. The requirements of our faith around forgiveness or the opportunities for redemption and so forth. And that really aligns with this whole notion of the prevailing paradigm of punishment or retribution versus one of engagement and forgiveness and care that ultimately is going to achieve outcomes. And community engagement is limited, as was talked about in the video, by the divisive systemic racism that exists. And it is only when that we have a deepened relationship and engagement of all people that we, I think, really give more, much more voice to those the realities of systemic relationship, and we have to move beyond the proposition of the either or of victim versus offender. So how do we create a better system? How do we tie all this together? Ultimately, we engage and we involve community. And that's what's going to ultimately create safer, stronger communities. And in particular, stronger and more effective outcomes by way of the criminal justice system. And so I would just say that, just to give one sense of context, if one of the measures might be recidivism. And I would just say this because I oftentimes think about the fact that, we exist in part to reduce levels of recidivism. And we know that there are, substance use issues, and there may be mental health, and there may be a whole range of issues that any one of us face, or people in our system face. But frequently, if we look at the people who achieve the best outcomes, and it is oftentimes those people who experience a level of intervention and then have the support of a network of people. And until and unless we, in people like in the roles I have, engage and encourage and ask for and even expect higher levels of community engagement to help with the people that we're trying to serve, we can achieve better outcomes. In our state, our recidivism rates have been, roughly somewhere about 26% of the people are going to reoffend in our system, and that has been consistent for decades. And we do believe that we can do better by people. We do believe that we can eke out better outcomes for them, for us, for the safety and goodness of our communities, to reduce levels of violence. But in order to do that, we're going to have to engage in a communitarian response to crime and wrongdoing, not a response of punishment and retribution. And so with that, I just would say thank you. And I'd love to just open it up for any comments, questions, challenges, discussion that people may have.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello, this is Father David Whitten Smith. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. I really love what you've been giving us. I find it very compelling. I'm wondering if you have a comment on how it would be impacted by psychopaths who, because of either genetic effect or brain injury, don't actually feel a conscience, don't feel what others are feeling. How do we deal with that? And how we still love them and consider them as worthwhile people.
And so I think that's a great question. I'm going to say that there are people, I think, that a small percentage, and I think this is part of one of the challenges that we face, is that oftentimes we overestimate the number of people who I think are sociopaths or psychopaths and really have no ability or to have that sense of conscience. There are some, but there are ways for us, I think, even from a community place, to more effectively address this. If we want to reduce, we certainly want to support them, and if there may be, we may have to just manage them much more closely. But I would just say this, that stronger connection and deeper community is not only about how we control or help aid the reintegration of people who have offended in the past, it is also a way of target hardening. In other words, we actually reduce the likelihood of stronger, deeper connections reduces the likelihood of people experiencing wrongdoing, because we start to watch out for people in different sort of ways. And so while you know, people who are sociopaths, the small number of people who are out there, may represent or reflect a high risk to us, one of the ways that we minimize that impact is also by strengthening community, which ultimately allows us to watch for, care about, and support and protect our neighbors and our fellow community members. So it's, you know, when you talk about that, you're talking about about 2% of the population or less. And I think ultimately it is something we have to be mindful of and recognize. But I think we can be more humane in how we manage those people, and even how we engage members of the public with them. I think, you know, you think about people who are civilly committed today, and oftentimes they die as very lonely lives. And while it may be necessary for them to be committed for the protection of themselves and the protection of others, the humane and response to them is really to maintain this sense of connection in the context of the community that they reside. So I think that there is a way to do both and recognize the absence of conscience that can exist in a small portion of people. It's interesting too, I would just add one quick thing. So often we would say to people, when we would do like processes, restorative justice processes, we would go to people who were offended and say, tell me, who is someone in your life at any given point in time that you really respected and admired? And frankly, sometimes for some people, sadly, they would talk about, you know, here they are in adulthood, and they're talking about that second grade teacher, and to try and find it. But there was literally no one else in the context in the remainder of their life that really rose to that level. And I think that's a sad testament to us as a society and our community. And I think if you know, there was a guy that I met who talked about the fact that, you know, if you look at outcomes for youth, and if there was 5 or more committed adults in that kid's life, that their outcomes economically, educationally, across the health, all those outcomes really look different if they had 5 or more committed and caring adults in their lives. And it was really the first time I heard this. I mean, it didn't surprise me, right? But at the same time, nobody ever told me that there was a number that you know, that if you have less than 5, your risk factors start to go up. And even though I should know that, and so we leave the rules vague. And so why couldn't we have communities where young people, if you see a dog in the background, you're not hallucinating, that's my dog that's just walked by, so just know that. But why do we leave the rules vague and ultimately tell young people that they can activate a network of people that can provide supports? And how do we help adults understand that if we could create a common language, that they could reach out to young people or adults for that matter, doesn't matter, and say, how is it that, you know, can I be of support? Can I be one of your 5? If we could create that kind of environment, what could the world look like if we could be that explicit about trying to create community?
Excellent presentation, Commissioner Schnell. And Father Harry has a question. Father Harry?
Thank you. Yes, very excellent presentation, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. In doing research for my book, An Invitation to Think and Feel Differently in the New Millennium, I visited a prison in Brazil. It was located in a small town, and I asked the superintendent of the prison what was the recidivism rate. And he said 13.7%. And I said, all over the world, it's 85 to 90%. How do you explain it? And he said, one word, respect. They have respect for the people who are incarcerated. And I said, well, how does that play out? Show me. I mean, what do you mean by respect? And he said, well, the people in the town come once a week and sing with the people who they don't call prisoners, but they call interns.
Right.
And also business people have set up opportunities for them to make a living while they're in the prison. So they can work and then they can use part of what they spend for the canteen, some to send home to their families, and some to get a social worker or a lawyer. So they're learning how to earn and to apply it in a responsible way, the money that they're making. And they're not, they don't, I went into the prison then to look around, and I couldn't tell the difference between the guards and the interns, because they were dressed in ordinary civilian clothes. And I asked one of them, what are you in here for, young fellow? I figured maybe he'd stolen some purses or something. And he said, well, I got angry and I killed a person. So they have serious person who committed serious crimes. I looked around, I didn't see any dogs, but I saw some cats. And on Sunday afternoons in the gym, they put up tents, and we were all men, and men could have their wives come and they could make love in the tents and privacy there. And it was things like that that demonstrated respect for the interns. And so my question to you is, you know, I'm afraid that the police in Minneapolis and throughout the country are perceived as being firm but not fair.
I agree with you.
And how are we going to train them to be both fair and firm? How are we going to train them to be engaged with the people of the neighborhood? I mean, they used to walk the beat and they knew, you know, the barber and the grocer, and they knew them by name and talked to them that way. And we've gotten away from that kind of interest in the community itself by living in the community and spending time with the people in the community. And that's what Twin Cities Nonviolent is doing. We're trying to get engaged and get more and more people into our movement so that we really can be engaged with the people of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So what can you do? I mean, you're in a position of quote unquote authority that a lot of us don't have. Help us to tell us what you're going to do different or are doing different, and then how we can help you.
I thank you for that. I just think it's really the right question. So some of the things that we're doing is we are looking at, it's interesting you bring up Brazil, because we're talking to folks from Norway who very similarly, right, we're engaging with a group of other corrections departments around the country here that are working with corrections officials in Norway, because they have a very similar thing. They're neighbors. They treat them like neighbors, because that's the reality of what's going to happen. 95% of the people in Minnesota's prisons today are going to come out. And yet we treat them in ways that are so different. So ultimately, I think what you point out is the fact that what's missing in policing, what's missing in our systems is it's all about to and not enough with. And I think ultimately, the only way we're going to change this is that we have to deepen the level of engagement and connection. And I think so for me, that means that what's going to change the correction system ultimately is not Paul Schnell just saying, look, we're going to treat people differently today, because there's been people saying that for 30 years and it hasn't made a difference. it's going to be when there is this, when there is people like this group that ultimately, I think, is engaged with us that creates this level of standard expectation that this is what's going to happen. And I will tell you that we're looking to change the system to really look at the ways in which we have a comprehensive plan. We're working with the governor to try and today, if you come into prison, needed services come at the end prior to your release, right? We want to make sure we do everything we can get right before you get out. And instead, we want to try and say, look, how do we address needs and challenges and risks that a person has, and support the community they're going to go to and be a part of, and have them in, not out there, but in and connected. When that happens, it changes the system. Our staff end up seeing something different. But right now, frankly, the reality is that the corrections on the back end of the system is the place that it's easy for to be forgotten about. It's the people that in many, this is not my view, but the people would say, look, they're rightfully where they belong, and we don't have to think about it. And that's frankly contrary to our own interest, and contrary to all the principles around nonviolence. And frankly, I think it's if we did this, if we had the same level of care provided and support to both the people who've offended and the people who experience harm, man, what a difference that world could be in terms of beginning to shatter that paradigm. And I think we're going to get there slowly but surely. We have to change the structure, because I think we've been asking people to change hearts and minds for 30 years, and that hasn't happened. Worldview has not changed, whether it's been about race or it's been about a lot of these things. That ultimately we have to begin to change the rules and create different expectations and have the community hold us to that. And I think one of the things that's happening as a result of the horrible tragedies of George Floyd, the aftermath and the response to that, is that ultimately there is a level of community engagement that I've not seen before, even as a police chief, I will say, around the fact that something needs to happen. And yet I worry that if we don't take every opportunity to deepen our engagement, that opportunity could be lost. And so the challenges we face is something that we have to capitalize on, and as much as possible to bring about the desired change that we all seek.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hector Garcia has a question. If you have a question, raise your hand and I will come to you. Hector,
Okay.
you raise your hand.
Yeah, I can't be seen right now, but hopefully you can hear me. I've had some trouble with my computer.
Yes,
Anyhow, thank you very much for your presentation, Commissioner Schnell. I find that many of the things that you said and some of the comments made by Father Harry and Father David and others are pivotal to developing the better system that you said needs to be attained. For example, the statement by Father Harry that all people are good, but often can do things wrong. And I think we're all guilty of that in varying degrees and intensity and consequences. There's you repeated statements about paradigms, about thinking in either or terms instead of both and, about punishing exclusively instead of reestablishing people in society. There are some key items that I've heard throughout this session that I think if they were distilled and emphasized so that they don't get lost in the discussion, as just one of the hundreds or thousands of things that were talked about. Because one of the last statements you made is we need to see things differently. That is the only thing that changes systems.
Right.
It's a new paradigm, a new perspective that encompasses the interests of opposing parties. And currently in the environment in which we live, which is adversarial, which is non-compromising, which is blaming and accusing, it's an enormous task. But I think, I guess I'm asking if you and others would consider trying to sit down specifically to isolate those pivotal sources of leverage that can harness the true sources of change so that they don't disappear in the midst of too many words.
Yeah, well, Hector, that's a great question. And I think that is, sometimes I worry that, we think about how do we tell a story, right? How do we tell the story? How do you move people? And I think that's such a really a great point. And I don't have a response other than to say, I think you're right, that we need to, and I certainly I'm open to any of you here who have ideas in terms of how we do distill that down to those key elements of change. Because I think if we don't, I mean, it's easy to talk about engagement of community, but then what does that mean? How do you actually have that happen? And I think we have ideas in terms of the ways in which we make that, we have that occur. We open up systems that traditionally have been closed. We give voice to people that have not oftentimes had voice, or were dismissed out of hand because you're in the system, you're in the joint, you're in prison. And I think those are things that we're trying to do. But I think that's such a cogent point. I really appreciate that. It's something I'm going to give thought to. And I would open and welcome anybody with thoughts in terms of how we do that. I'm going to actually put my email on here too, but because I do think that's the essence. And I think as we tell the story that ultimately allows us to move people and challenge people, it's important that it does not get lost in words.
Paul, what about gathering together a think tank to come up with those leverages?
And we are doing some of that. We do have some groups that are operating right now that are out there that are engaged in some of that. We have some groups of staff that are talking about ways, and we're bringing in people who were victims of crime. We're bringing in family members of people who are involved in the system to learn about what we're doing and to help us understand ways in which we could make a system that is both good for their loved ones and good for them. So I think we're doing that. I think it's how do we then tell that story or refine that. I think oftentimes the interesting part is we can find agreement. The challenge can become if we don't change the system structures and the processes that we've used. I mean, it's not different than when I was a police chief or frankly in any organization. It becomes easy for people to say, look, we're going to wait this guy out. That we're going to wait out this crisis that we're experiencing today. We're just going to wait it out, and things will go back to normal eventually. And I think if we don't take advantage of really distilling, to your point, Hector, what the key points are, and then changing the processes and structures in ways that just can't be unraveled because of a philosophical view, that says punishment is the way we need to go, that's going to set us in motion in a very different way. And that's one of the things I'm really committed to. And I think many of the people that work with me are also heavily involved in trying to create that change. And we have cultural issues that we have to face. So I appreciate that, and it's something I'm going to give thought to.
What kind of a training you have for the inmates who have come for different crimes to improve their behavior? At the same time, when they get out of the prison, what kind of a gainful employment they can get so they become the part of the society?
So I think the program stuff, one of the things that we've done, that we're doing right now is this whole notion of the reconnoitering of our system, so that if a person comes into the prison system today, you go through some level of assessment, and then you get sent to a prison based upon your offense, and you sit there for X amount of time, and you can engage in certain programs if you want. You could not engage in those activities. And so what we want to do in this person-centered approach is we want to bring people in. We want to conduct an array of different assessments. You know, it's crazy to me. You think about, here we say to people, look, you have opportunities for education, you have opportunities for treatment and mental health supports and cognitive skills programs and you know, vocational education training programs. There's a whole array of different options, but what we don't do is help people navigate things that we know are going to ultimately reduce their risk of reoffending and aid in their reintegration. And that means that we are not bringing family and their support networks in the ways that we should or could. And so we are really heavily engaged in redesigning that system of this comprehensive and robust assessment, very similar to the Mayo Clinic model, where the patient is in the center. And what we do is we provide that person information that we learned from them. It's not what we're telling them, we're telling you what you are. It's what we learned from you. And now the question really becomes, how do you and your support networks, how do we help you navigate this system that ultimately allows you to experience transformational programming, whether that's higher ed program or treatment or whatever it may be, connection with with the community on the as you go through, and then ultimately warm handoffs as you go back into the community. And what we would actually like to do is incentivize that by allowing people who deeply invest in themselves and in their support network to actually be able to realize shortened incarceration terms and even shortened sentences, because ultimately that's in our best interest and theirs. And it's a way, it really is a way of honoring the construct of redemption and reintegration.
May I follow up question?
Yeah, one more question has been asked. How
Okay.
can they get a PowerPoint presentation yours? You say you will be able to share it?
Yeah, I can share it. I'll try and put it on, I was gonna look here, there's a way to share it, and I'll try and find it here and get it and post it on here and go from there. But I'm happy to share it or send it back into the organization. I don't know what the best way to do that, but I'll make sure it's out there. Or you can email me too, and I'll get it to you.
About whatever you sent, TCNV can put it up on the website.
Okay, I think Kathy sent it today.
Yeah,
So,
she did send to me, so I think
okay, good.
I will do that.
Good. All right, excellent.
Okay, very quickly, thank you first for being agreeable to the possibility of getting together with a few of us. And just as very brief samples of what I'm talking about is you repeated the concept of shame several times. Now, it sounds fantastic in theory, but we all know that the whole of society has been fighting the idea of shame as something that should be avoided by all means. So discussing in a small think tank, okay, how do we get around this obstacle that's ever present? That's, one thing. Another thing, how do we get away from myths? Myths and deception don't lead anywhere, except to keep us where we're at. The myth of race classification has been done away with by several countries already. You can never accomplish the dream of Martin Luther King of judging children by their character and not by the color of their skin if everywhere you go, whether it be in schools, in corporations, in government, nonprofits, everywhere you see the race of classification. And the first thing that comes to your mind, what's it going to be? Well, is he black, brown, red, or white? We're undermining our own pursuit. That's the kind of think tank that I'm talking about.
So I think, as you talk about the notion of shame, I think John Braithwaite would talk about, that distinction of, what we know, like where people can connect with, like I said, that the sense of stigmatizing shame is, you are what you did, versus the reintegrative shame, that sense of the distinction between being able to separate the deed from the doer. And I think that those characterizations really, I think you're right, become very challenging for people, because the shame really only matters it can be very destructive. I think we all agree, but it in a communitarian sort of way, it is the thing that is fundamentally human about us, is that it's the sense of disconnection that we experience, and vulnerability. And I think that's the place where oftentimes the similarities between people who experience wrongdoing and the people who engage in wrongdoing both experience that. And so I think we have to be really mindful of that, but I do think that there are ways to tell that story. And I also agree with you. This whole notion of race classification, and we struggle because we do things like risk assessments, and people will say, well, look, your risk assessments, oftentimes people of color end up demonstrating or showing that they have higher risk factors, and that itself becomes defining. And when I initially was ashamed of the fact that sometimes our risk, the risk assessments showed that these differences oftentimes by race, and yet it makes some sense when you think about what's happened in the broader context of these are the people that came from neighborhoods that were heavily over policed, and where they were inadequately resourced, and there was oftentimes a lack of school support, and families were not lifted up, and opportunity wasn't the same, and the way we defined success was different. And so is it any different? And so to me, it becomes this whole notion of, if we're going to be equitably focused, it has to be on, we have to resource those people more. Today, what happens when we think about risk is that means that we use shorter supervision standards. In other words, we use higher levels of surveillance on those people, and then we wonder why we get outcomes that are challenging. And so I think it's, if we really want to understand this and break down some of those differences, it's by virtue of your needs as a person, of being person-centered, but recognizing the fact that along with that comes a history, and that ultimately the system in part created. And so it becomes part of the system's obligation to help address that. And I think that there are some opportunities for us along this way, as challenging as that will be. But I would love to engage with a group of people to have some conversations about this, and really even to test some of the things that as we look to create structural and systemic change, some of that from a policy standpoint, legislatively, some of that operationally, to be able to check some of our thinking and hold ourselves to a level of accountability of community input and engagement, fair process, is something I would love to engage in.
Thank you. One more last question. Anybody has question? Please raise your hand.
I saw there was one here just that came in about COVID and volunteers and support and those sorts of things. I appreciate it because, much like this gathering, COVID has really wreaked havoc, right? And we've done a lot of things to reduce our population, to create a sense of social distancing, but it also has really created a level of disconnection for the people that are in our care, custody, and control. It's because they're disconnected in deeper ways from their families who can't come in and visit, because we have the full continuum of people inside our facilities, everywhere from people in their teens to 90s, and many of them with a lot of medical vulnerabilities. And so we have to be really mindful of that. And yet we understand that you can't keep people disconnected for long and not have that itself become an issue. So I think we are looking at all the ways. We've just started doing some visiting in person, which was a big move and not very easy in COVID. And we have to we monitor, we test aggressively in our system, test our staff more aggressively because they're the ones who are bringing it in. But we have to get back to having volunteers come in, and volunteers really are part and parcel and critical to the operation of community-based programs. It's what allows us to have people have connection. And yet we have policies, so it's crazy. I was talking to a group the other day and they were saying, you have policies that say volunteers cannot have connection outside of their volunteer experience. So we have people who have been volunteering for a long time, know people inside, and now they're disconnected because they can't go in, but we don't allow them to have phone contact either, which is a policy that we created, and it's something that I think ultimately we have to we have to change the policies to make sure that we're not furthering disconnection, and so I think it was a great learning experience that came out of COVID. And so I've asked the policy team in that area to say, that doesn't make any sense. These people have invested, they know each other, but now you can't have contact because you can't talk on the phone. It doesn't make sense. So we're looking at that and going to change it.
This is Arvin. I had a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my camera is off. I'm behind that Twin Cities logo.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask, I lead a meditation center, and I've been interested in, I've been contacted a couple of times to see if there is possible to do some sort of a meditation teaching program, which scientifically it's known to change the brain, and it's changed to, change human behavior over time, especially when they're really interested in this. So, I'm just looking to see if there's an opportunity to create an online, just like this, a meditation program where we can engage remotely and, teach meditation and help answer questions to people who, how you can work on your own self to be more peaceful human being, to be more, calm person, and then practice a simple technique of meditation, which is universal. Can be done. So what are your thoughts on that?
I love it. We've had some conversation about mindfulness, and we've talked about that. I think we have some technology challenges in a prison setting right now. That's going to change. We're doing deployment of tablets to everyone, and we can allow people to access programming via those tablets once that goes, and that should happen in January. And so everybody would have access to that kind of stuff. But one of the things, and this goes back to, I think, the Father Burry's kind of observation earlier, that even as we do things like higher ed and those sorts of things, we're looking at opportunities where we can actually have both the people that are serving sentences and the staff participate in those programs together, right? So that whole image of mindfulness, when we could have mindfulness practices be done with the population and in concert and community with the people that are the staff that are there to both create safe environments and that kind of stuff. What a game changer that is. Or if I can take college classes at the same time as the person who is in taking college classes inside the prison. What a powerful way of creating ways of thinking different and building a stronger sense of community. And so I absolutely would love to take advantage of that. We'll have a little bit of a gap here, but there could be some opportunities for us to plan for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to work with you offline. Again, my name is Arvind Naik. I'll get in touch with you. And not only, as you said beautifully, that you extend it to the staff, but also their family members. Maybe it's also a good time to bind their family members and to not them feel like they've been separated, but their effort to connect them to the greater self, which will help them heal faster and get back into the right mindset.
I'm with you, and I love it.
Thank you.
Could we connect them also with the gang members of the gang they were in?
I think one of the things that we're seeing, I think is yes, I think we're even we want to make there's progress that can be made there. We can actually help with whether it's mindfulness could be a piece of that, some of the broader restorative practices that could be used to address some of the angst that exists within gangs, even the racial discord that can happen inside prisons, the white supremacists and the racial divide, even within, not just across race, but within race. In prisons, there's a clear pecking order. And so we have to really, I think, begin to address some of those things in that setting as well. So I think there's opportunities for us to practice mindfulness and engage in a host of other practices that can bring about and deepen and broaden a sense of community inside of our prisons. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I apologize for my technical problems at the beginning there, but we got it worked out, and never hesitate to call or write, and I really appreciate it.
Commissioner Schnell, on behalf of Twin City Nonviolent, we thank you very much for your excellent presentation. So I think there are many organizations who would like to work with you to do something.
Good.
So thanks again. Maybe we can have, you can come back again. We invite you.
I would love it. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I think to the audience here, there are another programs coming up at 4:30 p.m. On the Zoom. It's a prayer to forgive and for inner healing by Father David Smith. So that's an excellent program for the forgiveness. And then at 7 o'clock is a program, Nonviolent Peacekeeping in Minnesota by Mel Duncan. So these are the two great programs today, but then also the series of the programs are tomorrow, all the way until 27th. So please take part, and thank you again for joining.
All right, take care. Bye now.
Thanks, Hector Garcia, for connecting us with Paul, Commissioner Paul.
Thanks, Hector. Good to talk to you.
It was a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Paul.